What is morality and where does it come from? Imagine there's a woman who's born and raised in a fundamentalist Muslim family in a desolate part of Somalia. She's indoctrinated by clerics, beaten by her mother, even subjected to horrific female circumcision. But when her family leaves the country and she is educated in a more cosmopolitan city, she opens her mind to new books and ideas. When her family wants to arrange a marriage for her to a man she's never met, she rebels and flees to Europe to make a new life for herself, and even rejects her religion. I think many of you will agree that the society in which she was raised was vicious, even evil. And in her escape from this society, she exhibited moral heroism. So the question we're debating tonight is about how it can be true that her society was evil, and how it can be true that her actions in rebellion against it were morally good. We're debating the question, what is morality and where does it come from? The biological requirements of human life or divine love? It's worth clarifying that in asking and debating this question, we are debating whether a scientific worldview can underwrite moral truths. Another way of putting this is, what in the natural world makes it true that her society's brutality is vicious and her heroism is virtuous? Now, part of the reason this question is debated is because in the history of philosophy, some have proposed theories that render morality merely subjective or relative to cultural attitudes. Some say that to praise the woman's courage as virtuous is merely to talk about or express our feeling of approval for her actions, which means that moral claims are at best truths about our feelings, which of course vary from person to person or from society to society. So that her behavior will be heroic to us, but vicious to Somalians. At worst, these theories imply that moral judgments as mere expressions of emotion are, as they call it, non-cognitive. That is, not statements that can be true or false at all. Now, religious moralists say that to secure the possibility of genuine moral truth, we need a God who stands over and above human disagreements and fleeting emotions to issue timeless commandments that somehow make moral truths true. But there are other secular philosophers who say that the choice between subjectivist relativism and theistic morality is a false one. Now, few except the most committed theists take seriously that there can't be truth in physics, chemistry, or biology without a God to make them true. And I would venture to say that anyone who says otherwise has an astounding burden of proof to shoulder. The best naturalistic philosophers think that ethical truth is no different in principle from truth in these other sciences. In the last few decades, philosophers like Philippa Foot and Michael Thompson, and long before them, Aristotle, have shown how to think about this. Today, I will argue that if you're one of the many who don't think that truth in natural science is relativistic or mysterious, you should have no trouble thinking of moral truths in the same way. Now, the philosopher whose views I'll be applying today to this question is Ayn Rand. I work for the Ayn Rand Institute, no surprise. Rand goes further than other modern naturalistic Aristotelians in arguing that not only can there be moral truth in the absence of a God, but that it is the only way for there to be objective moral truth. I'll follow her lead and argue that when the concepts of religion are taken for what they really are, which is faith-based dogmas, they actually undermine the case for an objective morality. So what is morality? Before we can identify what makes moral truth possible, we have to first get clear on the nature of moral judgment. And there's a minor character in one of Rand's novels, Atlas Shrugged, who says, morality is judgment to distinguish right and wrong, vision to see the truth, courage to act upon it, dedication to that which is good, and integrity to stand by the good at any price. And yes, that's exactly right. Morality is a code of fundamental values for guiding the course of your entire life. Virtues like honesty, integrity, courage, and justice help guide the most important decisions in life, the ones that help you achieve the values you need to become the kind of person you aspire to become. These virtues include guidance for how to deal with other people in society, but importantly, they are not limited to rules for social relations. Think again about the example I started with. What makes the woman in this example courageous is her commitment to live free from others' influence, going by the judgment of her own mind and only it when answering questions about the basic nature of the universe. It's courage to act in the face of great challenges, whether they're imposed by others or by nature. Consider the courage of someone struggling with cancer. Virtue is about the excellence in action one needs to achieve the values that make up an excellent life, whether social values or entirely personal, psychological, or material values. The relationship that morality governs is not at base that between you and other people, but that between you and reality. Okay, but where does this morality actually come from? That is, what, if anything, are moral truths about? What is their basis in a mind-independent reality? It's a challenging question precisely because moral concepts are very abstract. That is, not closely connected to perceptually observable reality. We can't see honesty or integrity or justice walking down the street in the way that we see dogs or cats or tables or chairs. But that doesn't mean these concepts are just hot air. Atoms are also invisible and hard to know about. The proof only came in the 19th century. Yet scientists who talk of atoms are talking about something real because we can observe their effects and infer their existence as the cause. So the mere abstractness of a concept doesn't deprive it of a basis in reality. And there are other ways for abstract concepts to secure reference to reality apart from pointing to invisible entities. Consider, for example, a parallel case to moral concepts, I think. Concepts of the scientific method. Concepts like hypothesis, experiment, double-blind, replicability, etc. These don't refer to entities. They refer to actions and the ways we undertake them to test our beliefs' relation to reality. We desperately need to conceptualize these kinds of actions because the things that we think aren't true just because we think them. Thinking the world is flat doesn't make it so. To learn its real shape, we need to make systematic astronomical and terrestrial observations. Wanting to be pregnant doesn't make it so. You either are or you aren't. And especially early on, only specific biochemical tests will actually establish it. Precisely because there's this need to base our thinking on mind-independent facts, we also need concepts for methods of rational thinking that help identify norms of thinking. Definite courses of action that help us to identify the truth. Right ways of forming hypotheses and theories versus wrong ways. So there's right and wrong already built into the idea of a scientific norm. Now, we need concepts and methods, concepts of processes and methods, not only to guide our thinking, but to guide action more generally. We see this especially in the life sciences. Biology describes the more general processes of growth, locomotion, and metabolism. Physiology describes specific living activities for specific organisms, respiration, circulation, digestion, excretion, etc. Medicine describes, and very importantly, prescribes methods needed to fend off or cure illness and sustain health, methods of immunization, medication, surgery, nutrition, etc. All of these scientific fields conceptualize the actions and objects of action that undermine or perpetuate living processes. A new virus or poison or mental pathology hinders life. A new vaccine or antidote or therapy helps sustain it. The actions and processes that actually result in self-perpetuation are those we regard as healthy or proper, as good for the life of the organism. But to identify the right biochemical processes behind, say, an effective method of vaccination, a scientist like Kathleen Carrico also has to engage in the right methods of thinking, not just the right methods of experimentation, but the right general habits of thought. So even to identify these physiological biochemical processes that are good, that scientific method that we talked about is required. And that requires these general habits of thought. Habits like being intellectually honest enough to avoid fudging data because of confirmation bias, being courageous enough to move forward without external support and in the face of hostility, being independent-minded enough to experiment with entirely novel genetic methods, etc. To achieve the value of the truth, she has to exercise the virtue of wanting to know it and being willing to discover the methods needed for its discovery. She has to reject the vice of blinding herself by momentarily convenient fictions through intellectual laziness. The characteristic choices of the great scientist are just supremely clear examples of the characteristic choices of the morally virtuous man or woman. Moral values are continuous with the intellectual values of science. Whereas the life sciences identify conditions required for the good of the body, ethics identifies the conditions required for the wider good of a human character. Choosing right actions requires choosing the right ways of thinking, the ways that keep us focused on the facts rather than fictions. And this is why we see the virtues of the scientist in the virtues of the woman in our opening example. She is heroically rational in her willingness to insist on first-handed understanding of the truth, to confront the delusions of her elders, and to live on her own independently from them. I would argue that many other recognizable moral virtues have the same relation to the value of truth. Honesty means commitment to the truth, not faking it. Integrity means valuing the truth enough to act on it. Justice means recognizing the truth about the characters of other people. There are other commonly accepted virtues, like, say, for example, humility, that don't relate to truth in this way. But there are also conventional views in ethics that really do have no scientific basis and deserve to be abandoned. This scientific account of moral truth makes no appeal to divine commandments, yet it's also clearly antithetical to the subjectivist or relativist views of morality. It does not say that a scientist's or dissident's courage is virtuous because society approves of courage. On the contrary, it says that these heroes may be virtuous even when society opposes them. They are committed to the truth regardless of how it feels. And their virtue consists in the fact that rationally identifying the facts is causally efficacious for identifying the values we need to live. There's nothing made up about this. If Somalians think the woman is vicious, they're wrong about what values actually conduce to life. Ethics is the science that identifies the fundamental, natural, characterological requirements of human life, just as medicine identifies the physiological requirements. Scientific truths are not made up. Now, I've argued for a view of ethics that makes sense of objective morality in scientific, secular terms. I now want to argue that a religious theistic worldview, far from being the only way to make sense of objective morality, is anathema to it. First, the idea that divine commands are fundamental sources of moral norms dispenses with objective standards of morality in favor of arbitrariness. The classic example to illustrate this is the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Old Testament. God commands Abraham to kill his only begotten son, and Abraham willingly begins to comply. Now, believers take solace in the fact that God was only testing Abraham and didn't make him go through with it. But what he was testing was Abraham's blind willingness to follow a command to kill. Why? Why is this a virtuous character trait? In other parts of the Old Testament, the Judeo-Christian God commands his followers to go through with his command to kill innocent, non-threatening people. See, for example, the book of Deuteronomy 7 and 20, where God instructs the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites, men, women, and children, for the crime of worshiping false gods. Contemporary advocates of the divine command theory, like William Lane Craig, bite the bullet and say this killing really was justified. I would submit that a morality dictated by the commands of a God is basically arbitrary, not based on any objective standards. Now, defenders of religious morality have many, many answers to this objection, and you will hear some of them today. They say that because God is defined as a perfect being and is therefore perfectly good, his will is constrained by his nature from choosing nefarious commands. But this answer actually underscores why a religious worldview is not based on any objective standards. What is this perfect goodness of an omnipotent, infinite being? Nothing can be good or bad for such an immortal, indestructible being. This goodness has nothing to do with the pursuit and achievement of values in life that we are familiar with. Is God good because he loves us? Well, love is a response to the virtuous character of a select few as against the vicious. But God supposedly loves everyone equally, which empties love of any meaning. And what is a will? The will that God is supposed to use to issue his commandments perfectly. What is a will if it cannot choose between good and evil? It's unlike any human will we know through ordinary means. These concepts of goodness, love, will have no relation to observable evidence. And I should say, this is always the pattern of the theologians' dodges. How could an all-powerful, all-good God create a universe filled with natural disasters that cause suffering? Their answer is typically, we may not understand God's mysterious ways, but this suffering must serve some higher good purpose, and we must accept this on faith. Here, the idea of a good purpose is used arbitrarily. In the same way that Old Testament conquerors, Christian inquisitors, and Islamic terrorists arbitrarily claimed that their acts of violence serve good purposes that we simply cannot understand and must accept by faith. Theologians who appeal to faith to arbitrarily redefine key concepts double down on dismissing the need for scientific objectivity. In principle, the very idea of divine commands as a source for moral truth is incompatible with a respect for objectivity. As I stressed earlier, it's precisely because there's a need to base our thinking on mind-independent facts that we also need concepts for methods of rational, objective thinking. But if the universe as a whole is ruled by an all-powerful God who could have made it completely differently, its existence is contingent on his will, there are no mind-independent facts that could serve as standard for an objective method. Something may be independent of human minds, but not of the biggest mind of them all, of course, God's. Religious demands for human objectivity hijack a modern scientific term and use it to smuggle in a demand for humility. They think unaided human reason is impotent in their view. It works only by grace of the divine power that has created the universe in the first place. This is why, in practice, religious moral codes do not bother to deduce human obligations from their alleged knowledge of God's perfect nature. Having taken for granted that God is the source of morality, they proceed to use Scripture as the source of a revealed morality accepted on faith. We are to follow God's arbitrary commandments, not his reasoned explanations for why we should do the things that he recommends. And when we are commanded to do the opposite of what we presumed was good, like Abraham, we are not to ask questions, but obey to demonstrate our faith. Faith-based morality is the opposite of objective morality. Faith is what that woman in my opening example was no longer willing to demonstrate. If you thought she was a moral hero for resisting the pressure of her elders and for escaping to the West, you'll have considerable difficulty explaining what is morally heroic about it by the standards of Judeo-Christian morality, to say nothing of Islam. To love the truth, as she once did, is to do the hard work it takes to know the truth, which means searching for evidence that tests one's conclusions. This kind of work is not restricted to scientists. Any of us does it on any subject when we ask critical questions and reject convenient beliefs even when it is unpopular to do so. If you admire explorers, discoverers, independent-minded critics, truth-tellers of every kind, you should be willing to be like she was and challenge the archaic assumption that we can gain meaningful life guidance by consulting the contradictory scribblings of ancient desert religions. Thank you.
It seems very difficult to talk and then hear yourself a half second afterwards, but you did a great job, and I'll try to do the same. I want to thank Michael, first of all, for organizing this debate, him and his Ayn Rand Club. Thank you so much for hosting this and putting it together. And the Ratio Christi Club as well, partnered with them to organize this debate. So I'm very thankful for that. And thank you, Dr. Bayer, for engaging with me in this important discussion. I'm very happy to be here. Now imagine you're hiking up a mountain with a friend, and you discover something that kind of looks like the sculpture of a horse. After looking it over, you're convinced that your theory is correct. It's an ancient sculpture that intelligent minds, humans, designed and carved out of the rock. But your friend disagrees. She thinks it's just a boulder that happens to look like a horse. So you two have a debate, both giving reasons to think your theory is the better explanation. Well, there's a similar debate going on between atheists and theists. We find ourselves here in this reality, and we've discovered some interesting things. For example, we exist in this intricate universe that began sometime in the finite past. Since this universe has many features which seem designed and fine-tuned, theists argue that the best explanation is that it came from some sort of intelligent mind that they call God. Many say this fine-tuning argument is the strongest argument for God's existence. Atheists, of course, argue that God isn't the best explanation and propose other theories. Now, another peculiar thing we've discovered here in reality is moral truth. And here, quickly, are 4 aspects to moral truth that we've discovered. First, we've discovered that some actions are morally good, like building an orphanage, and some actions are bad, murder, rape. But what makes some actions good and others bad? Second, humans have moral obligations. There are certain things we ought to do and other things that we shouldn't. But where do these oughts come from? Third, humans have moral worth. Every person is special and should not be abused or used to satisfy someone else's selfish interests. But why are humans more special than other forms of life, such as bacteria or thorn bushes? Fourth, humans have moral rights. such as the right to life and various freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of belief. But how do we have such rights and other animals like cows do not? Now, there's many atheists who claim these moral statements aren't objectively true, but are merely your subjective beliefs, similar to your favorite flavor of ice cream. Now, your favorite ice cream is subjective because it depends only on your thinking. So if you change your mind about your favorite flavor, then your favorite flavor changes because it's based only on how you think. There's no objectively right or wrong flavor of ice cream. It's subjective and thus relative per person. My favorite's chocolate, but maybe yours is vanilla. So these type of atheists claim our moral beliefs are subjective like this and thus relative per person or maybe per culture. Americans think it's good to greet someone by shaking their hand and looking them in the eye, so that's right for them. But Japanese think it's good to greet someone by bowing, so that's right for them. See, it's relative. Now, Dr. Bayer and I, both of us, reject this theory of subjective morality. We agree there's more to morality than merely our own ideas, that there are objectively fixed moral truths that are independent of what we think. We agree moral truths are objective, similar to mathematical truths, that somehow they're fixed, independent from us, and can't be changed even if our beliefs about them change. So here's a helpful thought experiment to figure out if something is subjective or objective. Imagine a mad scientist. Imagine a mad scientist giving us all pills to change the way that we think. If he gave us all pills so that, gross pistachio ice cream was our favorite, would that make pistachio our favorite? Yes, it would. Because our favorite ice cream is determined by how we think and therefore subjective. But if a mad scientist, let's say, gave us all pills so that we thought 2 + 2 = 5, would that make 2 + 2 = 5? No, because that mathematical truth is objectively fixed, independent of what we think. So here's the key question. Is morality determined subjectively by how we think, like our favorite ice cream? Or is it objectively fixed, independent from us, like 2 + 2 = 4? If a mad scientist gave us all pills so that we woke up tomorrow believing that rape was morally acceptable, would that make rape morally acceptable? No. Rape would still be evil even if none of us believed it was, because that moral truth is objectively fixed, independent of what we think. Now, most people, including Dr. Bayer and I, believe that morality is objective, but that's not enough. We can't stop there. We shouldn't believe anything with blind faith. All of our beliefs should be based on good reasons and evidence. So in order to justify our belief that moral truth is objective, we need to provide a good explanation for how it can be objectively true. And that's what this debate is about. Who has the best explanation for why morality is objectively true? Now, various explanations have been proposed throughout the centuries, of course, and I actually agree with Ayn Rand's two favorite philosophers, Aristotle and Aquinas. I agree with them in that God is the source of moral truth. So, for example, Aristotle argued that there must be a first unmoved mover, which he called God, a living, intelligent, eternal, most good being who's the source of order. Thomas Aquinas argued that each good thing that is not its goodness is good by participation. But that which is good by participation has something prior to it from which it receives goodness, and this can't proceed to infinity. We must therefore reach some first good that is not good by participation, but is good through its own essence, and this is God. Now, nearly all theists agree that God is the source of moral truth, but they disagree about exactly how this works. I myself have proposed a Christian explanation of morality called divine love theory. Just like Dr. Bayer's theory is based on Ayn Rand's work, my theory was influenced mostly by three Christian philosophers that I'd like to tell you a little bit about. The first one is Alasdair MacIntyre. He's been a professor at Oxford, Notre Dame, Duke, Yale, Princeton, among other schools. His philosophy focuses on these two philosophers, Aristotle and Aquinas. As a result of his study, he converted to Christianity around the age of 50. And most say his book, After Virtue, is one of the most important works of moral philosophy from the 20th century. The other philosopher that influenced me as I developed my theory was John Hare. He's a professor at Yale who earned his bachelor's at Oxford, Ph.D. at Princeton. And in his book, God and Morality, he's got an entire chapter devoted to where he argues Aristotle's theistic theory of morality breaks down if God is removed from his theory. The last one, probably leaving the last for the greatest in terms of his influence on my theory, is Robert Adams. Adams earned his degrees at Princeton, Oxford, Cornell, and was a professor at UCLA, Yale, and Oxford. His book, Finite and Infinite Goods, argues that God is the ultimate fixed standard of moral goodness, and therefore a human action is morally good when it resembles God's goodness. Now, my theory is similar to Adams', but I propose that the ultimate moral goodness is the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. God is one being, but three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. And the love between these divine persons is the perfect standard of moral goodness. This love is similar to a fixed, unchanging measuring stick, by which our actions can be measured to see if they're morally good or not. And that's how my theory explains what makes an action morally good. It's morally good to build an orphanage because that resembles the ultimate fixed standard of goodness, the love within the Trinity. But if I tell, let's say, hurtful lies about someone, that's morally bad because it doesn't resemble the love within the Trinity. Now, my explanation for moral obligations is a little bit more in depth. Moral obligations is why we ought to do good things. And in my theory, it begins with the fact that God created us to extend the loving fellowship of the Trinity. So our obligations arise or originate from this purpose God created us for, to enjoy loving relationships with Him and with others. Our obligations then are generated when God makes us aware of what's good and bad and that we should do what's good. And God makes us aware of these things indirectly through our conscience, rational reflection, and also directly by giving us commands. Now, it's important to note here that God's commands are merely instructions on how to best achieve the purpose we were created for, to love God and love others. We should follow God's instructions because of our loving relationship with Him. Obeying God is one of the ways we express our love for Him. So in that sense, the basis of our obligations is our relationship with God, similar to a parent-child relationship. My theory also explains why every single man, woman, and child, including the unborn child, has moral worth. Because we're created in God's image to resemble Him in enjoying loving relationships. My theory also explains moral rights. I believe our country's founding fathers were correct that we're all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And these rights flow from the fact that we're created in God's image to enjoy loving relationships. Now I'll address Dr. Bayer's comments from his first speech. First, I encourage the audience not to be distracted by red herrings that really aren't pertinent to this debate. This debate's not about how to interpret Bible stories of Abraham and Isaac or why God allows evil and suffering in the world. Those are important topics, and here are some resources to check out about those things. But this debate is about who has the best explanation for objective morality. Second, I would like to say that Dr. Bayer misunderstands what Christians mean by faith. Yes, there are a few Christians, mostly who've been influenced by postmodern philosophy, do think of faith as the opposite of reason, as some sort of blind leap of faith. But most Christians maintain that faith is simply trusting someone or something because of good reasons and evidence. For example, I trust or put my faith in my wife based on good reasons and evidence that she's a trustworthy person. Similarly, I put my faith in Christ based on good reasons and evidence that Christianity is true. And just like my trust in my wife has grown over 27 years of marriage, so my faith or trust in Christ has grown as I've discovered many more reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true. Now, as for Dr. Bayer's moral theory, he's given us really no good reason to think that morality can be reduced to mere scientific facts. Now, science is great, don't get me wrong, we should celebrate science, but science is only a process to discover truth through experiments and observations. Yes, it helps us know facts about what causes humans to live long and prosper, but it can't tell us why the prospering of humans is morally better than the prospering of other forms of life, say grasshoppers. If there's no God, then atheist scientist Richard Dawkins, I think, is correct, that in a universe of blind physical forces, you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. There is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. It just is, and we dance to its music. Now, Dr. Bayer hasn't given us a convincing explanation of what makes something morally good. What makes building an orphanage a morally good thing to do? Now, sure, if you redefine good to mean that which helps an organism survive and prosper, then certainly there are scientific facts about what helps achieve that goal. But why assume in the first place that it's morally good for a human organism to survive and prosper? He hasn't given us good reasons to accept that huge assumption at the foundation of his theory. Now, we might think human survival and prospering is good, but that's the very definition of being subjective, not objective. Dr. Bayer said a virus hinders human life, but developing a vaccine sustains human life, and therefore we'd regard it as good for the life of the human organism. But that's by definition relative, because it's only good relative to that organism. But that's by definition, and it's subjective. It's only good because we'd regard the vaccine as good. But that wouldn't mean it's objectively good. It's only good relative to and subjectively to the organism it helps. I'm sure the virus would subjectively regard our vaccine as evil, because it's certainly not good for the life of that organism. A person may think it's good for them to survive and prosper, but that's subjective, not objective. So the very foundation of Dr. Bayer's theory fails to meet his own definition of being objective, because, according to his theory, a person makes these things true by how he thinks. Under Dr. Bayer's theory, if, let's say, go back to the thought experiment with the mad scientist, if he gave us all pills so that we thought our surviving and prospering was bad, would that make it bad? Yes, it would. Because according to his theory, whether our survival and prospering is good or not is determined only by how we think, which is subjective. Yes, if someone doesn't do things that cause them to survive, they'll soon die, but so what? Under his theory, why is it morally bad for a human to die? He might say, well, Isn't it better for you to survive instead of die? Of course, I think that it's better, but that's, again, subjective. It doesn't mean my surviving is objectively good independently of what I think. What makes the prospering of some random organism, humans, morally good? If we've just been cobbled together through a haphazard process of evolution, then, as James Rachels points out, we're not entitled to regard our own adaptive behavior as somehow better or higher than that of the cockroach. Dr. Bayer also hasn't explained where our moral obligations come from. Why should we do good things? How could the biological requirements of human life give us moral obligations? Now, we talked about aspiring to live an excellent life. He pointed out that there are objective facts about how to achieve that goal and thinks his job is done. That he's shown morality is objective. But there's at least two problems with this. First, he's leapt over a huge assumption. He's just assumed that a certain type of life is more excellent than others. But he didn't provide any good reason to think that one type of life is more excellent than another's. He just proposed a subjective goal and then pointed out there are objectively true steps to achieve that goal. But why assume that goal itself is objectively good? He can't just assume that. He has to explain what makes an excellent life objectively good and not merely something that some would prefer. Second, even if we grant his huge assumption that there's an objectively excellent life, why do we have an objective obligation to pursue it? He talked about aspiring to an excellent life, but aspiring is an objective. It's not a fixed truth independent of our thinking, like 2 + 2 = 4. Aspiring is subjective because it's based on the person's internal desire to be a certain kind of person. His theory depends on the subjective choice that if someone aspires to become an excellent person, then they should take certain steps. So someone's obligations are determined by their own subjective aspiration. But if someone doesn't subjectively aspire to be excellent, then they wouldn't have any obligation to pursue such steps. If there's no God, then atheist scientist Jacques Monod is correct, that man at last knows he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he emerged only by chance, and his destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is his duty. Now, lastly, Dr. Bayer hasn't explained why humans have moral worth. If there's no God, then there's nothing special about human beings. We just happen to be a few steps further down the evolutionary path, cobbled together accidentally through a random process of mutation and natural selection. If we ever encounter higher forms of life in the universe, why should they consider us any more valuable than we consider sewer rats? Of course, we think we're special, but that's subjective. If there's no God, atheist Bertrand Russell was correct that man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, growth, hopes, fears, loves, beliefs are nothing but the outcome of accidental collection of atoms. Just 2 more sentences. Dr. Bayer also hasn't explained where moral rights come from. If there's no God, Nietzsche was correct that moral rights were invented by weak people to try to make strong people feel guilty for oppressing them. If there's no God, then I think atheist Peter Singer is correct that our insistence of human moral rights is an unwarranted specious type of chauvinism. Thank you so much.
Clicker. Thank you. Slower? Lower the voice? Okay. So I'm actually going to defer most of my defense of the scientific alternative to religious morality to my next speech. Most of what I want to hammer home here is why I think religious morality not only doesn't offer the best explanation for objective morality, it doesn't explain it at all. But I want to first raise one issue that will help show this, but will support my theory in the end. What do we mean by objective? My opponent claims that objective moral truth means truths that are, quote, fixed, independent from us, and that can't be changed even if our beliefs about them change. Now, I should say I don't think there are two kinds of truth. One that's objective truth, the other subjective truth. There's just truth. A statement is true when it corresponds to the facts, and facts independent of anyone's belief about them. You can talk about objective truth to emphasize that those facts are out there, mind independent. But the main reason to bring the concept of objectivity into ethics is to say something about how we know about the relevant facts. When we talk about objective journalism or objective interpretation of the law, it's not as though there's some perfect newspaper article or judicial decision that's already out there written for us in reality, waiting to be discovered. Rather, objective journalism, objective interpretation of law are objective when there's a certain kind of human product, a certain kind of thinking that is created by human beings by looking at the facts. That's what objectivity means. Objective values are the same way. Valuing is something that you do. It's your pursuit of certain objects of action, and you can pursue them in two ways: by rationally deciding what to pursue, or by acting on unprocessed emotional reactions. Objective values are pursued through commitment to reality, commitment of human beings to reality. Subjective ones are not. And this is the main reason why a morality of faith is not an objective morality. Conscience does not give us access to a world of value properties. It is not any kind of sensory perception, which is what scientific objectivity depends upon. And that's especially true if the alleged facts are baseless thoughts in the mind of a supernatural being, which means they are definitely not mind independent, and so non-objective in every possible sense. But more on this soon. In the next talk, I'm going to explain why an objective morality treats knowledge of moral virtues and vices as parallel to knowledge of scientific method. That's why I argued earlier that virtues like courage, integrity, and honesty help us gain the value of the truth, just as various norms of scientific procedure do, a parallel my opponent notably did not address. Are rules for scientific experiments not objective because scientists' desire to know the truth is only their thought, only subjective? It's strange to say that the desire to learn, the mind-independent truth, the desire to be objective is not itself objective. And since moral virtues are also about finding the knowledge that you need to live in reality, it makes sense to say that they are objective in a similar way. Okay, so what does it mean to explain the basis of objective morality? To debate about how to explain some fact, you first have to agree on the fact to be explained. That's easy to do when it's a horse-shaped stone in front of your eyes. You can both look at the same stone. But as I discussed, morality doesn't have a look. And my opponent and I don't actually agree on which acts all count as moral, as is true of the difference generally between seriously secular and seriously religious worldviews. I began my speech with the example of the Somalian woman who breaks with her family and tradition to escape to the West. She's being courageous, a moral virtue, but her courage is in her rational pride. She's the opposite of someone like Abraham, who's universally celebrated by Christians for his faithful humility. So which kind of fact are we trying to explain here? The moral virtue of the Somalian woman or the alleged virtue of Abraham, who's willing to kill his son? You have to decide for yourself, because there's nothing in common between them to explain. Johnson's theory doesn't explain why her rational pride is virtuous, and he never tried to show how his theory does. Her action has nothing to do with love for others or for God. She's defying others and rejecting belief in God, escaping injustice and irrationality for her own good. My opponent should tell us if he thinks his theory can explain her moral virtue, or he should admit that in his view she's sinfully proud, as great Christian philosophers like St. Augustine would insist. Now, the idea that the Abraham example depends on idiosyncratic questions of biblical interpretation, that is the real red herring in what we've just heard. Suppose the Abraham story weren't in the Bible. My opponent should still answer the question: if some higher being commanded you to kill your son, making it known to your conscience that to show your love for him you must do this, would that make it actually right? It's not a wacky hypothetical question. Numerous religious people through the ages have justified their killing in the name of God on such grounds. And prominent philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas, who he quoted in the last speech, have affirmed that if God says killing Isaac is right, it must be. See Summa Theologica 1-2, question 100, article 8. By the way, Aristotle was not one of these philosophers. His prime mover isn't even a creator god. There's no sense in which he's responsible for moral order. That was a misrepresentation of Aristotle's view. My opponent should address the straightforward hypothetical question: does a divine command to kill an innocent child or innocent Canaanites make it right? If it would, why think this explains the objective morality of the act? If he doesn't want to answer this question, why not? The Abraham-type example shows that divine command theory doesn't explain objective morality at all. If his theory does imply that a willingness to follow a higher being's command to kill your only son is morally good, it doesn't explain the morality of the act because it's not a moral act. It's especially not an explanation of objective morality. If someone's obligation derives from some revelation of a higher being's will, the morality in question is not grasped through scientific reasoning about mind-independent facts, but through feelings about the whimsical will of a supernatural bully. Relying on conscience to know something, let alone the mind of some alleged higher being, is as subjective as it gets. Conscience is not a sixth sense. Different people regularly have incompatible moral feelings about the same fact. That's why this theory is not one of objective moral values, but subjective values driven by blind faith. Incidentally, the first book by Copan that my opponent cites only helps prove my case. It justifies Abraham's willingness to kill Isaac by celebrating his faith that a higher being would maybe resurrect Isaac. See page 48 of that book that he cited. No rational evidence could justify such a belief. That same book tries to explain away the passages about the slaughter of the Canaanites and others by saying that Old Testament passages specifying orders to kill men, women, and children were just exaggerating. It's just a joke to think that even the attitudes of these Israelite boasters or Abraham could be morally admirable, to say nothing of their actions, which often carried out their boasts. Now, my opponent argues that only a few postmodernist Christians think faith is blind and the opposite of reason. His scholars' take on the Abraham case should call this into question. And his case for why faith and reason are compatible is based on an old bait-and-switch argument from St. Augustine. When you trust your loved ones, you have good reason to, so faith is actually rational. Now, you do have good reason to trust people you've known personally, like your parents, whose track record of truth-telling you know, whose means of knowing, like your own, you understand. But this faith, quote-unquote, which is really just rational trust, is based on observed evidence, for example, of your parents, and gives you reason to trust comprehensible propositions. For instance, don't touch the hot stove. None of this is true about the faith you're supposed to have about a higher being. Consider just the doctrine of the Trinity, on which he bases his whole ethical theory. It has no rational basis in the evidence. It's so paradoxical, and I think you can see that from this diagram. The Father is God, who is the Son, but he's not the Son. So paradoxical, it's usually celebrated by believers as a mystery. There's one God, but he has three distinct persons at the same time, who are co-substantial with each other. He is Father and Son to himself. Now, theologians have far-fetched rationalizations for this, but few who believe in the Trinity know them, and they believe the doctrine in spite of its ostensible incoherence. It's not just a few postmodernists, but great Christian philosophers like Aquinas in Summa Theologica 1:2, question 1, article 5, who say this is an article of faith, not something demonstrated by reason. Faith-based morality gives us no objective means of knowing how we are to practice a God-given morality. How can we know how to emulate the love of a higher being, and in what respect? Since the three persons love each other, but they're all the same God, they love themselves. So should we love others or just ourselves? Why should we love a higher being when he does not love a higher being? And how can we emulate God's unconditional love for everybody when that empties love of its ordinary meaning, which discriminates between good and bad people? These have no real answers, but we're supposed to just know through our conscience. This faith is blind. It's not based on any evidence. It's subjective all the way down. The only objective morality is one based on observation and scientific inference on the five senses, not some sixth sense of morality. In my next talk, I'll explain how morality based on the biological requirements of life gives us this objective morality. Thank you.
I'm really thankful for this debate. It gives me the opportunity to clarify my theory and show why it's a better explanation for objective morality than Dr. Bayer's theory. And remember, that's what this debate is all about. Now, Bayer and I agree that there are objective, mind-independent moral facts that are true no matter what we think about them. And we agree on many moral issues, like it's bad to murder or it's bad to be racist, it's good to fight injustice, like in his Somalian example. We also agree there are objective ways to know if something is good or bad, such as rational reflection. Science, too, even helps us learn what's good or bad by helping us to see how different actions affect people. If science helps us understand a certain action harms people, that helps us know that it's bad, for example. Now, I am convinced, partly due to observed evidence, that we also have a conscience, which functions as a built-in mechanism to help us know what's good and bad. Children don't have to run a scientific experiment to know that harming others or stealing is wrong. There are some things which are just clearly good or bad, and our conscience helps us recognize that. Now, Dr. Bayer doesn't think we have a conscience, but that's a minor disagreement. Our main disagreement isn't about how we know what's morally good or bad. Our main disagreement is about what makes something good or bad. Dr. Bayer and I agree that harming people is morally bad, but what makes harming people bad? We both argue our theory best explains how morality is objective and that the other person's theory winds up making morality subjective and arbitrary. Dr. Bayer argued that my theory makes morality arbitrary because God could command any crazy thing, like that we should eat kittens for breakfast, and somehow that would make it good. He's trying to show that God's commands could change morality to be radically different, and therefore my theory makes morality arbitrary. But God can't command something evil because he's morally perfect. Also, Dr. Bayer doesn't really understand my theory. He thinks my theory is all based on God's commands, but in actuality, God's commands play a fairly small role in my theory. So let me be clear. God's commands are not what makes something good or bad. God's will, according to my theory, is not what makes something good or bad. Thoughts in God's mind don't make something good or bad. Now, maybe Dr. Bayer has heard that some Christians might believe these things, but he's not debating those Christians. He's debating me, and that's not my theory at all. No, what I would say is that God's commands are just one way that he helps us become aware of what's good and bad. But there's other ways he helps us become aware of these things, including rational reflection, science, and our conscience. Now, when God, through any of these means, makes us aware of what's good and bad and that we should do what's good, that is what generates our moral obligations. But let me say it again. God's commands are not what makes something morally good or bad. It's God's loving and just moral nature. That's the determining factor that makes something good or bad. So if a human action resembles God's loving and just nature, then it's good. And if an action doesn't resemble that, then it's bad. Now, Dr. Bayer has proposed something else is what determines whether an action is good or bad. He claims something is good if it leads to human survival and prospering, and bad if it doesn't. But this isn't a plausible explanation of objective morality because it actually makes morality subjective and arbitrary. If there's no God, our moral beliefs came about through a random, accidental process of evolution. So if our evolutionary path would have played out differently, then what we think about morality would also be radically different. Therefore, if there's no God, then morality is subjective and arbitrary. Even Charles Darwin recognized this when he wrote that if men, for example, were reared under the same conditions as bees, our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Under Dr. Bayer's theory, what we call love is merely a chemical reaction nature selected in our random evolutionary path because it led to greater chances of reproduction. If there's no God, then our moral beliefs are random and arbitrary. They'd be radically different if our evolutionary path took a different turn. Michael Roos, atheist philosophy of science professor at Florida State University, wrote that morality is merely a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such a reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Darwinian theory shows that morality is a function of subjective feelings, but it also shows that we have the illusion of objectivity. Morality is a collective illusion foisted upon us by our genes. Now, if there's no God, I don't see how he could be incorrect. If there's no God, our moral beliefs are random, arbitrary, accidental, subjective human ideas, nature selected, because they increased our chances of survival and reproduction. Now, as for Dr. Bayer's comments concerning faith, I'm a bit surprised that he thinks my faith or rational trust in God isn't based on observed evidence. He might not be familiar with all of the solid evidence that Christianity is true, including scientific evidence for the existence of God. Another resource I might recommend to you, a book called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. In this book, Dr. Stephen Barr explains how scientific discoveries over the last 100 years provide really strong evidence that there is a God. And this comes from a respected scientist. Dr. Barr is a physics professor at the University of Delaware. Even right here, I had coffee this afternoon with Dr. Coons. He's a philosophy professor here on this campus and does groundbreaking work on the first cause argument for God, the argument made famous by Aristotle. Now let me explain a little bit this first cause argument, because it has carryover to our conversation tonight. The first cause argument begins by noting that when we evaluate an effect, when we see an effect in reality, we naturally ask, what caused this? And once we figure out that cause, then we ask, well, what caused that? And then what caused that? And so on and so forth. And to avoid this going on forever, there must be something ultimate that just is, that doesn't have a cause. That's the only two options. Either there's an infinite number of causes going backwards forever, or there was a first cause. Now, philosophers and mathematicians have shown that there can't be an infinite number of causes because it's illogical for an actual infinite series to exist. So there must be a first cause, something that wasn't caused by anything else but just exists on its own. And since there must be a first cause, eventually we reach a point where when you ask, well, what caused that? You just have to stop because there must be something that just doesn't have a cause. Now, some used to think that the universe was the ultimate thing that's just always been there, that didn't have a cause. But then science proved that the universe had a beginning, so it can't be the first cause. And of course, theists argue that God is the best explanation for this first cause. Now, I'm summarizing the first cause argument here because this debate about moral goodness follows a similar pattern. Call it the first good argument. G.E. Moore's open question dilemma helps explain why theories like Dr. Bayer's are unsuccessful. Dr. Moore, one of the founders of analytic philosophy, said that people commit a naturalistic fallacy when they try to define moral goodness by identifying it with a natural property, such as the avoidance of harm, or in this case, survival. Whatever property someone claims is identical with moral goodness, it's an open question whether that property itself is morally good. If someone claims, for example, moral goodness is just what causes humans to survive and prosper, Moore's open question becomes, well, why is human survival and prospering morally good? And Dr. Bayer hasn't given us good reasons to accept that major assumption at the foundation of his theory. Now, Moore argued that the only way to avoid this open question dilemma is to conclude, as he did, that moral goodness is a separate, non-reductive property. The conversation would go like this. Why is fighting injustice morally good? Dr. Bayer might say that it's morally good because it leads to human survival and flourishing. But why is human survival and flourishing morally good? And so on and so forth. So, similar to the first cause argument, this first good argument, to avoid this going on forever, there must be something ultimate that just is the good itself. That's why every moral theory has to propose some sort of moral ultimate. Eventually, we reach a point where when you ask, well, why is that good? You just have to stop because, again, to avoid an infinite series, there must be something that just is goodness itself. It's similar to the first cause argument in the sense that there's nothing before it that caused it, and there's nothing behind it that makes it good. It just is the good. Dr. Bayer proposed human survival and prospering is the ultimate good, whereas I propose that God is the ultimate good. Now, every moral theory has to have some sort of ultimate moral good, otherwise you run into that infinite regress problem. The question becomes, which proposed ultimate good is the better, more plausible explanation for objective morality? Now, in this speech, all I've covered is Bayer's theory of what makes something morally good. He still hasn't explained where our moral obligations come from, why humans have moral worth, and where moral rights come from. Thank you.
Our basic disagreement is really about how we know what's true. Is it by objective reason or by subjective faith? My opponent has not answered my argument that objectivity concerns how we know. That is, it concerns using a logical method based on observable facts to grasp what's true. We need this method because we can't just assume any notion we reflect on is right. Objective thinkers discard ideas that aren't fact-based. My opponent is not being objective in his attempt to explain morality. Explanation concerns identifying the cause of an effect. But his explanations, so-called, appeal to no known causal mechanisms, claiming that we know either the commands or the love of a Trinitarian God is no more fact-based than appealing to voices from an imaginary friend with multiple personalities. My opponent never explained how his supposed cause explains his data. Why don't we imitate this God who loves his personalities when we love him by following his commands, including his command to sacrifice our son? This God, by the way, supposedly loved and sacrificed his own son. You may remember that story. So why doesn't Abraham imitate him by sacrificing his? That's a parallel that's often drawn by theologians to justify it. Incidentally, my opponent's theory does say that God's will creates obligations, even if it doesn't create what's good, because to be obligated, one must know the good. See page 98 of his book. My opponent also never explains why the woman who bravely rejects religion is somehow similar to a God who loves himself, or why Christians who'd condemn her prideful pursuit of happiness are wrong. What's the connection? He's also not objective about the data he's trying to explain. He takes for granted that we all agree about the morality of orphanages, the immorality of murder, but I bet that you all think that part of the evil of murder is that murder is actually bad for the victim. But he says being bad for a thing's life is merely relative and subjective. So he should know he doesn't agree with any of us about the data. My opponent also ignores the whole alleged explanatory basis of his theory, the doctrine of the Trinity, that it is sheer blind faith, and that Christians have always held this. That is non-objectivity writ large. Notice that he changes the subject to a completely different issue, arguments for the existence of God. Now, parenthetically, most philosophers rightly dispute the logic of these arguments. Ask me about any of them if you want to in the Q&A. But it's important that almost nobody who believes in God believes because of these arguments. At most, they are used to rationalize prior belief. Objective thinkers reject ideas they can't support. They don't look for excuses to keep holding on to them. A scientific explanation of morality explains the basis of the concept of morality. In my first speech, I pointed out first the grounds of scientific norms, the fact that not everything we think is true. We need a method to know. Norms like objectivity itself. Normativity is inherent in scientific thinking. That is, saying something ought to be done or ought to be thought. That there's a right and a wrong way of thinking is inherent in scientific thinking. But science also studies certain facts about the nature of life, which ground evaluative norms more generally. An organism does not survive regardless of what it does. It needs to follow a definite course of action, that is to say, what it ought to do if it is to remain in existence. It's this fact The fact that living organisms remain in existence only by following a specific course of action that explains all values and all oughts. This isn't to say that life is one good thing among others, let alone just because we happen to prefer it. It's a much deeper point than that. It's saying that life is the only fact that makes any values possible at all. If the universe were lifeless, with nothing but stars, rocks, and energy fields, there would be no entities to which anything could be good or bad. Things would just happen. We can also explain the ultimate value of life. The ultimate value of life without any kind of infinite regress. What is living action good for? What is nutrition, locomotion, growth? What are these things good for? Well, they're good for more nutrition, locomotion, growth. That is, more life. Life is an end in itself, not because it is some end state unrelated to anything, but because when it succeeds, it is a self-reinforcing activity. Value concepts have no other basis. No rational basis for them has ever been offered. Any other basis is hot air. You can read Ayn Rand's elaboration of this argument in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics, copies of which are in the back. And the idea that the good is relative or subjective, if it's in relation to the life of an organism, is really just silly, equivocal sophistry. In physics, the weight of an object is assessed only in relation to the mass of another body pulling on it, as opposed to something like mass, which is not relational. So you know, of course, your weight reduces as you go further out in space. Weight is a relational property. It only holds in relation to the other massive body. That's why astronauts are basically weightless. We're not on Earth. So weight is a relational property, just like goodness, but it's an objectively identifiable relational property that scientists study. That doesn't make it relative, not relative in the sense of being relative to mere belief, which is the kind of relativity that subjectivists talk about. The same is true for goodness. The goodness of the sun in relation to a plant. It's only good if it's not too close. So, if it's rumored that some philosophers think some things are just plain good, but they're not good for anyone or for any known purpose, the objective response to them should be, this claim has no basis. It has no meaning. Toss it out. Likewise, if you think God's love is good, but it's not good for anything God needs to do because he's an eternal, indestructible being, you should toss that out too. The life-based theory of the good explains the very moral judgments that I've endorsed. For human beings, nothing better enables the end of living than grasping the truth about what enables life. Our minds are our basic tool of survival. Human beings prosper through thinking and production. And I argued, without getting any response, for why recognizable moral virtues like honesty and integrity and justice, virtues the woman in my example exemplifies, all embody the rational pursuit of truth. This is why my opponent's argument about evolution is irrelevant. The atheists who think morality is a subjective illusion don't understand the relevance of biology to value. Morality isn't a feeling that is pre-programmed by our genes. It is a form of rational knowledge we discover about values that promote our life. Our minds were naturally selected for the enormous survival value of the ability to discover the truth. This is not random. There's a causal connection between having this ability and continuing to survive. The mutation that gave us the ability may have been random in the sense that it was unpredictable, but it's his burden to show that we or it could have been otherwise. If it were otherwise, if we were really raised as bees, yeah, we would need to act as bees, but then we would not be who we are. We would be of a different species. The fact is that we are not. Objective morality doesn't speculate about how the facts might have been or ask what makes them keep being the way they are. It's sheer religious faith to think something had to make the facts what they are. Objective morality accepts the facts for what they are and gives guidance in light of them. Thank you.
I must say it is fun to see the slides. Obviously, we've seen each other's speeches, so we could write good responses back and forth, but we haven't seen each other's slides, and so it's kind of like reading the book before seeing the movie, and now you get to see the images that go along with it. So I've enjoyed seeing his slides as we go through this. All right, let me ask you this question. Does Dr. Bayer's description of morality sound at all like your own moral experiences? So Dr. Bayer is saying that morality is all about surviving. Your decisions of what you should do are based on staying alive. He says this explains your moral values and your duties. Morality is about what furthers you and your own survival. Self-preservation is your most important goal, your greatest moral value, he says. The purpose of your life, which is merely nutrition, locomotion, and growth, is nothing else than, well, more nutrition, more locomotion, and more growth. The purpose of your life is simply to survive. But does this sound at all like your own experiences of morality? Is that how you make moral decisions based on your own survival? Is that how you evaluate other people's moral decisions, that they're good or bad depending on what helps them survive? Do we think Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was morally good because it helps him survive and prosper? Now, yes, we have a strong survival instinct, otherwise we'd be drinking poison, jumping off cliffs, but that's not primarily what morality is about. There's so much more to our lives, to being human, than our survival instinct. Now think about your own moral experiences. When you've done something wrong nobody knew about, maybe you stole something, cheated on an exam, lied to your friend. Later you recognize it was wrong and you're frustrated at yourself. We've had that experience. But in those experiences, did your own survival play any part? Or when you've done good, wonderful things like fighting for people's rights or protecting those who can't protect themselves, you know you've done something good and you feel great joy and fulfillment. But in those experiences, did your own survival play a part? No, Dr. Bayer's explanation of morality doesn't describe our moral experiences at all. His description of morality sounds more like a robot's programming. If we view ourselves only through the lens of science, I suppose he is right. That's all we are. Biological survival machines. If we look at life purely scientifically, there's really nothing else for you but to try to stay alive as long as possible and compete against others to get as much for yourselves as you can. If we limit ourselves to only a narrow scientific perspective, then I would say Dr. Bayer and Richard Dawkins are correct. Dawkins wrote that we're survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment. Though I've known it for years, I never seem to get fully used to it. Now, I would say he can't get used to it because it's not true. It cuts across the grain of everything we are as human beings. There's just so much more to life, to being human, than what can be described through science. Don't get me wrong, again, science is great, should be celebrated. It's a wonderful tool to help us learn about the physical world, but I think it's a huge mistake to reduce everything, especially our lives, down to mere scientific facts. There's more to you than what can be described scientifically. You're more than just your physical, biological parts. Now consider what it does to our humanity when we think of ourselves and of others as just these programmed biological machines. Dr. Bayer's theory reminds me of all of the novels and the movies that describe the terrible dystopian futures we'd create if we view ourselves only through a narrow scientific lens. In fact, Dr. Bayer's ideas have reminded me of the machines in one of my favorite movie franchises, The Matrix. Now, the machines in The Matrix, if you remember, thought survival was all that mattered, and they ridiculed humans for thinking there was more to life than surviving. In the final battle, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, fights for humanity against these machines, specifically the machine program, Agent Smith. And after a long battle, Agent Smith loses his patience with Neo, and he yells out, "Do you believe you're fighting for something more than your own survival? Can you tell me what it is? Do you even know? Is it freedom or truth? Perhaps peace? Could it be for love? Illusions, Mr. Anderson." I'm not going to do the impersonation, so don't ask. Temporary constructs of a feeble human intellect trying desperately to justify an existence that is without meaning or purpose, and all of them are as artificial as the Matrix itself. Again, go back to your own moral experiences. Reflect on those. When you think through your moral decisions, either your decisions or others, you don't focus on how those decisions affect survival. No, you focus on how they affect other people and your relationships with them. Of course, you consider how decisions affect yourself too, but you don't make your moral decisions based on what's going to maximize your survival. If you thought that way, you'd end up viewing others as expendable, mere instruments to help you survive and satisfy your own desires. That's why Dr. Bayer hasn't been able to explain moral rights, because under his theory, it's hard to justify other people even have rights when everything centers around my survival. Bayer's moral philosophy paints a false, ugly picture of what life is all about. It describes us as cold, calculating, ruthless machines, using other people to optimize our own survival, satisfy our own desires. But that's not how we view other people. No, our moral experiences primarily have to do with our relationships with others. The purpose of life isn't survival, but to enjoy loving relationships. They change over time, of course. Initially, our parents, friends later in life, often a spouse, and then our own children. But on our deathbed, I think we all recognize that that is what life is about. All of our greatest stories, our greatest poems, music are about our relationships, not about more nutrition, more locomotion, more growth. Because life and morality mostly has to do with our relationships. We make our moral decisions and evaluate the decisions of others based on how they affect people and our relationships with them. The question then is, what best explains these moral experiences we all have? Now, one of the reasons that I believe that Christianity is true is because its description of reality fits so well with what we actually experience. And this is especially true of our moral experiences. Because according to Christianity, the very purpose you were created for is to enjoy loving relationships with God and with others. And this fits perfectly well with what we actually experience. That loving relationships are the most important thing, the very purpose and meaning of life. Dr. Bayer's description of morality just doesn't fit our moral experience. And that's another reason it fails as an explanation of objective morality. Thank you.
We have two more speeches. One each will be about 5 minutes, and then we will have Q&A. So I just want to remind you what I started with, which is a woman raised in an oppressive Muslim culture who rebels against it and escapes to a free country, rejecting the faith that oppressed her. Is her act one of courage and integrity, morally virtuous and worthy of praise? My experience is that I admire such a woman who inspires me to stand up for what's true and what's right. I react with outrage to her persecutors and would be angered if she were to betray her principles. Now, my opponent has never explained how his view would explain the validity of these parts of my experience. I have explained them by arguing that these moral virtues embody the relentless pursuit of truth, the attainment of which is an irreplaceable value enabling and constituting what's distinctive about human life. Even after making this case, my opponent paints my position as holding up nothing but brute, animalistic, even robotic existence as the end of morality. And he does that by seizing on one sentence in my previous speech, ignoring the rest, about how life involves nutrition, locomotion, and growth. That's a neat rhetorical trick to plug the hole left by his failed argument for the relativism of life-based norms. But the desperate, out-of-context quotation ignores how the motion and growth of a human being is essentially different from that of a lion or a fern. Human locomotion is not about chasing prey, it's about building cities and writing novels. We don't just grow larger with age. If we choose to make the effort, we grow in knowledge, in wisdom, and in character. And my opponent thinks that his survival is best served by cheating on exams, lying to friends, and invading defenseless countries. This reveals more about his own conception of living well than it shows what actually constitutes a human life. That a few unphilosophical atheists have the same idea is his problem and their problem. They're free to see how well their lives will go if they try living like animals. The rest of us know that lying comatose connected to IV machines or being plugged into the matrix is not a human life. It might constitute the survival of a vegetable, but not of a human being. Religious apologists frequently claim that the only alternative to allegedly scientific views that reduce human life to materialistic mechanisms is a faith-based morality. But that is a dishonest straw man. There are obvious third alternatives. My view, and Rand's, which should be obvious from my examples, is that human beings are beings of integrated body and soul, with free will, whose life is enabled and realized by the attainment of material and intellectual values, like the achievements of great scientists, artists, and dissident activists like the woman in my example. Part of what it means to offer an objective explanation of morality is to be willing to challenge what people take for granted as their moral experience. It's true that many think morality is only about disregarding one's own interests and focusing on others. But that's a product of a view of ethics that's a result of Christianity's influence on the West, not something that the ancient Greeks like Aristotle would have taken seriously. An objective explanation of morality looks for facts that explain why we actually need moral concepts and is willing to dismiss and criticize aspects of our moral thinking that isn't grounded in fact. Ask me later for how respect for others' rights fits into a life-based view of ethics. Your choice today is between a rational view of morality based on facts about the needs of human life and a faith-based morality that reduces virtue to the humble acceptance of a supernatural being's commands, like Abraham's willingness to kill Isaac, as the only source of moral knowledge. My opponent has failed to show he has anything other than sheer faith at the basis of his moral theory. I'll close as I ended my first speech. If you admire explorers, discoverers, independent-minded critics, truth-tellers, you should be willing to challenge the archaic assumption that we can gain meaningful life guidance by consulting the contradictory scribblings of ancient desert religions. Thank you. And check out this book at the back of the room on this topic.
Thank you for your patience. We're almost done. I will tell you, it is a bit disconcerting when you read and then hear yourself a half second afterwards, and that might be why we're reading a little bit slower than normal. Now, and I think most of us, mostly agree with Dr. Bayer's description of the ideal moral life, what the ideal moral life should look like. fighting injustice, developing integrity, striving to be virtuous. His mistake is that he thinks he can build such a moral theory on the foundation of biological survival. In other words, Dr. Bayard tried to build a bridge from biological survival to this ideal moral life. But if you start with biological survival, somehow he's saying that you end up with this ideal moral life. And that's where I think he makes a mistake. I think that is the blind leap of faith. As they say in New England, you just can't get there from here. Now, you can claim this will ultimately lead to that, but Dr. Bayard has failed to connect the dots and explain how you can start with human survival and then end up with what we all pretty much agree on is the ideal moral life. The biological requirements for human life alone just don't get you there. If you take a purely scientific view of morality, you end up not with a nice, flowery utopia, but a dog-eat-dog survival of the fittest, where people use others to try to get as much life for themselves as they can. Now, as we conclude, let me quickly summarize my position. As humans, we've discovered some interesting things. We've discovered we exist in this fine-tuned universe that began sometime in the finite past. We've discovered moral truth, objective moral truth. Some actions are good, others bad. We've discovered authoritative moral oughts, things that we ought to do, and we experience these oughts pulling us somehow, pulling on us. We know we have an obligation, a duty to do the right thing. The question is, what's the best explanation for these moral truths? If there is no God, it's hard to see how morality could be anything more than just subjective feelings that nature selected because they led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. Tonight, I've argued that Christianity provides the best explanation for the subjective moral truth we've discovered. Now, another thing we've discovered through experience is that we're all moral failures. We all understand what the ideal moral life should look like. We all can envision that. But we all fail to live up to that ideal. We're selfish, we're hateful, we treat others unfairly. But the good news is that Christianity also explains the solution to our moral failures. If Christianity is true, and there's good, strong reason to believe it is, then you were created by God for the purpose of enjoying loving relationships with Him and with others. That's the meaning of life. Love's not an illusion or a biological accident. It's actually the foundation of ultimate reality, intrinsic to the relationships of the Trinity. The problem is that your moral failures and my moral failures have broken our relationship with God. Thankfully, though, God still loves us. That's why He orchestrated a way for our moral failures to be forgiven and for you to be reconciled back to a right relationship with a God who made you and loves you. One of the members of the Trinity, God the Son, took on human nature and lived as one of us, giving us a perfect moral example of how humans should live. Jesus taught that we should care for the poor, forgive those who have hurt us, and look out not only for our own interest, but also the interest of others. Though He was innocent, He died on a cross to pay the penalty we deserve for our moral failures. Greater love has no one than this, that He laid down His life for His friends. Now, Jesus warned not to trust your own efforts to fix your relationship with God. It's impossible to earn your way back into a right relationship with God because our moral failures are just too great. He promised that instead of trusting what you could do, that if you would trust in Him and what He did for you on the cross, you'd be forgiven of your moral failures, reconciled back to God, and welcomed to spend eternity loving Him and others in heaven. I choose to trust in Christ, to be a Christian, based on good reasons and evidence, and I encourage you to do so as well. I want to thank again Michael for organizing this debate, his Ayn Rand Club, and Rasha Christie, and thank you to Dr. Bayard for engaging in this debate. And thank you for coming tonight.
Okay, Doc. virtue that surpasses one's own life? Are there no virtuous reasons? Are there no virtuous reasons to sacrifice your life for something greater?
I think that's enough for me to answer. My view is that one's own life is the ultimate value that one is pursuing. It's the only value that can be and serve as an ultimate value. The virtues are what I described: honesty, rationality, integrity, justice. I should also mention productiveness, the virtue of pride. These are principles that we need if we are to live a flourishing life. There's never been a rational reason given by any philosopher that I know of for why there should be any other ultimate value, for why sacrificing one's only life is somehow virtuous. You have only one life to live. The reason that we need concepts of value and virtue is to identify and describe the definite course of action that makes that life possible. The only reasons that have ever been given for why we should just give it up for no purpose of our own are actually reasons of religious faith. There are secular philosophers who claim to have given arguments. They ultimately reduce to matters of faith. That's all I can say right now. Do you want to comment?
I think I'd just rather go to the next question.
Okay, next question.
I think our system is being hacked into. Mr. Johnson, what do you say of Bayer's Abraham example? Is he a moral figure? Was killing his son, or the willingness to kill his son, moral?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. There's been a lot of debate on how to best interpret that story of Abraham and Isaac. So the first thing that I would say about this is it's pretty clear that the intent of the story is not to teach moral theory, right? That's always the important thing to try to, when you're trying to interpret an author, what is their intent? What are they trying to communicate through a story? And certainly it's not the intent of the author to teach moral theory or explain God's moral nature through the story. And so we understand from other scripture and from rational philosophy that God is a perfect moral being and could never command something evil. And so when Old Testament scholars have tried to interpret this story and try to figure out what is the purpose of it or what's trying to be communicated to it, there's been a lot of debate about that, and it's kind of an interesting conversation. So here are two proposed interpretations that I think show some promise. The first one is that it could be that the story is intended to, you want to try the other mic? The purpose of the story is to actually teach Abraham and the rest of the Israelites that they shouldn't sacrifice human beings. You remember, a ram was brought in instead to sacrifice instead of Isaac, right? God did not have Abraham go through with it. It might be a very powerful way of God teaching Abraham that sacrificing humans is wrong. And so that he would not follow that practice like what was being practiced by a lot of people groups around him. I think another possible interpretation that has promise is that this was a very powerful way to teach us about God's love for us. Because remember, God did not have Abraham go through with it. So in other words, God would never ask us to sacrifice our own children. However, God was willing to do something that he would never ask us to do. He was willing to sacrifice his own son out of his love for us when he had allowed Jesus to be sacrificed on the cross. So it could be, that this story is teaching us about God's love for us?
It's a strange thing to say that God would want to teach the lesson that sacrifice is wrong if his other big lesson is sacrificing his own son. I don't see how those fit together. And in fact, theologians have always drawn parallels between the two of them, that Abraham was willing to do the very thing that God eventually ended up doing. I pointed that out in the speech. In any case, it's a time-honored interpretation that the major moral virtue that Abraham is demonstrating is humility. Humility and willing to be faithfully obedient. That's the full-throated view of St. Augustine, who's one of the major church fathers. Read City of God. There are whole chapters about this. Maybe people disagree with that, but as I said, this isn't really an issue of biblical interpretation. Pretend it's not in the Bible. What's the answer to the question? If God really did command you to kill your own son, would that make it right? If he really did command it.
The next question is for Dr. Bayer. How do we know the woman is courageous while the elders are delusional? What if the elders' views are objectively more conducive to life? For example, maintaining social order in a turbulent society?
Well, the easy answer to that question is that it's a hypothetical situation. I made it that way. But it's a hypothetical situation obviously inspired by the story of Ayn Rand, for those of you who know. I didn't mention her by name because she recently converted to Christianity. For very bad reasons. It's certainly possible for someone's elders to be wiser than a young person. It happens all the time. But we're not just talking here about somebody who knows more trying to teach someone who knows less. We're talking about someone who is expecting a young person to believe them on faith. What is the faithful basis for female genital mutilation? And since it was argued earlier that, well, there's reasons to believe Christianity, there's evidence apparently in favor of Christianity, I suppose it's the Bible. Why is the Bible better evidence than the Quran? Why is the Bible better evidence than the Bhagavad Gita? They each have their own texts. They're asked to believe them. I assume some people in this room don't think that the Quran has adequate evidence in its defense. Well, that's then part of the reason why she's being asked to believe these things on faith.
I did not pick up on that was the person you were referring to, but I wish I would have now, considering that she converted to Christianity. That's very interesting. But I would say, going back to your Somalian example, I would say, according to my theory, that it was good for her to run away, or even if she would return and fight that injustice that she was subjected to. And I would say that that would be the case even if it was supposed Christians who were doing that to her, or if it was atheists who were doing that to her. I would say to run away from that injustice or to fight that injustice would be a good thing because it would resemble God's justice and love. I would just take a second, and when you ask me directly, and I think that's an appropriate thing to do, ask me directly, what would I do if God commanded me to murder my son, sacrifice my son? And I would say that I don't think I could ever be convinced that God was commanding me to do something horrendously evil like that. Because I don't think that God, because of his morally perfect nature, could command us to do something evil like that. And so it would be similar to asking me if I do some horrendous evil, if God commanded me to, is similar to asking Dr. Bayer if he would do some horrendous evil if it was discovered that it would lead to human survival and flourishing. We'd have a similar answer. Bayer would say that that never happened because a horrendous evil would never lead to human survival and flourishing. And I'd say that never happened because God, given his moral perfection, would never command me to do that horrendous evil. So in a nutshell, that's how I would respond to that.
Both speakers identified goodness with a standard, divine love or human life. Dr. Johnson says Dr. Bayers isn't objective because it doesn't say why our survival is good. Doesn't the same apply to divine love?
That's a question for you.
Okay. Yeah, and this might go back, if you can follow the train of thought in the first good argument, or Moore's open question dilemma, that every moral theory, religious, non-religious, secular, has to have some sort of ultimate good, right? Otherwise you run into that infinite regress. There's got to be some ultimate moral good that just is goodness itself. And so we're proposing similarly to the first cause argument that God is that ultimate good. He is goodness itself. There's nothing behind God that makes him good. He just is the good. And this would be part and parcel of Robert Adams' moral theory, and mine as well, and most Christian moral theories, that God is the ultimate good. Every moral theory has to have an ultimate good. Dr. Bayers does. Any atheistic theory has to have some sort of ultimate good. And so then you ask the question, what's the most plausible of all the proposals for ultimate good? What is the most plausible proposal of what is the ultimate moral good?
So notice that the infinite regress argument that we talked about only gets started in the first place because you think one thing is good for another. What's X good for? It's good for Y. What's Y good for? It's good for Z. So it starts with the presupposition that good is good for something. And then the answer that you're looking for is, how do you stop that regress? Well, he argues you stop it by finding something that's just good, but not good for anything. This intrinsic good that God is supposed to be. Trouble is that you're then not actually talking about goodness, because the concept is always, and you can see it from the way the argument works, about one thing being good for another, one thing being good for something. But God's goodness isn't good for anything. It's not even good for God. God doesn't need anything. He's indestructible and immortal and eternal. You'll notice that the way that I stop the regress doesn't have this problem. I say, things are good for life. Life is good for more life, because life has to be a self-sustaining process, and it cuts itself off if it fails. So you can make the argument that some allegedly intrinsic good stops the regress, but to me that's like saying an intrinsic blah 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 stops the regress. I don't know what you're talking about when you talk about an intrinsic good that is not good for anything, that's just good. It's a meaningless concept that has no relation to reality.
This is for Dr. Bayer. How do the atheists quoted by Dr. Johnson, such as Dawkins and I think Michael Ruth, differ from Ayn Rand's view of morality?
Lots of ways. I hinted at this in my speech. I don't think these atheists understand the connection that I was trying to show between biology and concepts of value, between this idea that good is good for the life of a living organism. That has important implications. It means that there is knowledge of the good that we can discover. It means that goodness is not just a subjective illusion that's programmed by our genetics. The whole impetus for this evolutionary argument against objective morality assumes that morality is just an evolved belief that we happen to have. That's not the case. We evolve a mind that acquires knowledge, including knowledge about the good. And that's something, I don't blame the atheists quoted for not seeing this so much, because it's a failure of philosophers generally to understand how there can be rational knowledge of the good, and they're just cashing in on that failure. Most secular theorists, in one way or another, offer some version of subjectivism, and that's a non-starter.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to see how morality could be anything more. If there is no God, right? If we're making the assumption of naturalism or materialism, that all that exists is the physical material universe, and we evolved haphazardly through this process. It's very difficult for me to see how morality could be anything more than just subjective beliefs that accidentally happened, but that caused our, in the evolutionary story, ancestors to survive better, reproduce better, because they had those sort of beliefs, and so nature picked them up because they were more conducive to reproduction and survival. In our particular species, as the story often goes, and as Darwin mentioned, if our evolutionary path would have taken a different route, then different beliefs nature would have caught on, or picked up, or selected, because those other beliefs, if our evolutionary path was different, would. And to me, that just makes morality so arbitrary that it could be, because the evolutionary path was arbitrary, so it really takes away from any sort of objective or fixedness concerning morality.
Okay, we have another question for Dr. Bayer. You say you believe in free will. How do you explain free will from an atheistic perspective?
I love this question. Thank you, whoever asked it. I've written a number of articles on the subject, so go to newideal.aynrand.org to learn more about it. But the essence of the answer is, in a way, what I already talked about in my first speech. There's a kind of normativity that's inherent in scientific reasoning. There's such a thing as a rational scientific argument. There are irrational arguments. The idea that you can have rational scientific hypotheses, irrational scientific theories, that there's a difference between the two of them, the difference in norm. There's a right way to do it, there's a wrong way to do science. Well, if you think there's a difference as a scientist between a rational and irrational theory, that presupposes that you can make a difference, that you could do better, that if you adopt an irrational theory, you could have done better, you could have adopted a rational theory. So that presupposes you could have done otherwise. That's the fundamental choice. In Ayn Rand's philosophy, the locus of our free will is our choice to think or not to think, our choice to be rational or irrational. And that is a basic form of control that we have over our lives via the control that we have over our minds. That is free will. And I take exception to what was said before, that in the atheist's universe, it's materialistic. I'm an atheist, I'm not a materialist. I think human beings have minds that are not reducible to matter. That's part of what makes sense of the possibility of free will. And it has all kinds of implications for how to think about ethics, because it means we are not just animals, it means we are not just bees, it means that we have to make choices, and that we have choices that concern the good of our soul, the good of our mind, not just of our body.
And that is interesting, and I'm aware that there are atheists who aren't naturalists. I did not know that about you, but the atheist that I have interacted with probably the most is Eric Wielenberg, and he also is not a naturalist. So the question about free will is interesting because it's not necessarily standard for one side or the other. In other words, there's some atheists believe we have free will, some atheists don't, right? And then on the Christian side, there are some Christians who believe we have free will and some Christians who don't believe we have free will. So it's interesting, this whole conversation concerning free will. In terms of plugging our various writings, I would encourage you to check out my website, convincingproof.org, and I've written about this. One of the common explanations that atheists propose in terms of how we can have free will is via emergent properties, and that our mind and consciousness and then our ability to make choices is an emergent property. It emerges from the physical matter. It's Wielenberg's position on free will, and I've got an article on that issue of emergentism on my website, Emergent Free Will.
Okay, Dr. Johnson, this is for you. When you speak of God, you mean your Christian God. What about Allah?
Yeah, what about him? So if I'm going to lay out, right, an extended case that Christianity is true, I usually start with arguments for the existence of God. I discussed some of them tonight. I had coffee with Dr. Coons this afternoon. We talked about the first cause argument that he's so well known for. All those arguments just get you to a generic supreme being, right? And so basically those arguments will divide the room between the atheists and the theists. And if those arguments are solid, then there is a God, there is a supreme being, some sort of ultimate being. But then among theists, obviously there's differences among theists as to what this God is like. And so the question then becomes, well, whose conception of God is correct? Is the Muslim's description of God correct, or is the Christian's description of God correct? And how do you know? And that's where I would, in my laying out a case for Christianity, the next step then would be, well, wouldn't it be great if God communicated to us, right, and told us what he was like? And that's, of course, what most every religious group claims, is that they have some sort of message from God. Then the question becomes, well, how do we know what really is a message from God or not? And I would say the key way to answer that question is miracles. So the best way, or the best hallmark of the divine, and this is an argument made really popular by John Locke, one of the Enlightenment thinkers in the 1700s, that the miraculous, God's message is going to be, to know if something really is a message from God or not, is if it's authenticated by real miracles. And so that's where I would make the case that the miracles of Jesus and his disciples have an incredible more amount of historical evidence than the supposed miracles associated with Islam. And then that would lead us to believe that the messages that Christians claim really are from God and are in fact. And so that description of God is where I would say it's correct, because we have good reasons and evidence to believe those messages really are from God, in particular Jesus' message, based on the evidence for his miracles, in a nutshell.
I addressed this a little bit already in one of the previous questions, but what could the reason possibly be to think that Christian claims of miracles are somehow more reliable than Muslim claims of miracles? At least the Quran was written by, or ostensibly written by, one person who claims that the miracles happened directly to him, and only 1,400 years ago as opposed to 2,000 years ago. Everybody should read Bart Ehrman, whose books like Jesus Interrupted give an astounding account of all of the unreliable facts about the Bible that we are given today as the Christian truth. There were no Gospels written by anybody who knew Jesus Christ. They were all written decades after Christ, not by any of the apostles who were alive at the time. So it's second, third, fourth-hand testimony, but it doesn't really matter, because even if you saw a miracle yourself, didn't have to hear about it in some text that was written, what possible reason could it have to present to you that you're receiving a message from God? The most that it can tell you is something very strange is happening. Or maybe you didn't understand what you thought the natural laws were that are ostensibly being violated by the miracle. Here I recommend a very trustworthy argument from David Hume, who said that it would have to be miraculous. It would have to be miraculous that, let me start over again. Hume basically argues that it can never be more likely that the miracle is happening than that the faculty that you normally rely on to trust other people is somehow going wrong. The only reason you have to trust people in the first place is because there's a cause and effect connection between what they see and what you hear from them. Their track record of truth. That's relying on your knowledge of cause and effect. If, in order to believe what someone is telling you about a miracle that you heard, or to believe your own eyes about a miracle that you're allegedly seeing, you'd have to throw out your knowledge of cause and effect. You'd have no reason to trust your eyes. You'd have no reason to trust other people in the first place. I recommend this argument that's in his dialogues concerning natural religion.
Okay, a question for Dr. Bayer. Can you define faith? And I would add to that question, what do you think the role of faith is in a human life?
I mean, I think it was implicit in my speech that faith is belief not in the basis of evidence. It's not the same thing as trusting another person. You can have evidence that grounds your trust in another person. You can have evidence that a text that you read is reliable if it's well corroborated by other historical sources. That's not faith, that's rational trust. Faith is believing without reliable evidence. And there are a lot of things that people believe that way. I think the example of the Trinity is one. There are many others.
So faith is a term that's used in many different ways, right? Like most words in our English language, they can be used to mean different things. The word bark can be used to mean all sorts of things. So when somebody uses the word faith, I think it's important, again, going back to authorial intent, as to what they're trying to get at. What concept are they trying to get at when they use the word faith? Because sometimes faith is used in terms of a blind leap of faith, right? You take a blind leap of faith, you just close your eyes and jump, not based on any reasons and evidence. That's how faith is used sometimes. In the Christian context, that's not how we're using it, at least not my understanding of Christianity. I think what the Scripture teaches, especially what Jesus taught, is that faith should be trusting someone or something based on good reasons and evidence. The whole name of my ministry is called Convincing Proof, based on Acts 1:3, which says that Jesus provided many convincing proofs of his resurrection. And so I think all of our beliefs should be based on good reasons and evidence, whether it's our belief, a scientific belief, or a belief that you're trusting in your spouse, or in this case, trusting in Christ. By the way, I would also recommend Bart Ehrman. I did a whole series of lectures on his book, Did Jesus Exist?, where he lays out all the historical evidence for Jesus in his messages. So you can check that out on my website, or just Bart Ehrman's book directly, Did Jesus Exist?
Okay, this is a question for both of you. What's good about good relationships? How does it relate to divine love or human survival?
Me first?
If you're ready, go ahead.
So I can use this as a way to answer the question that was asked of me in the debate in which I said you should ask me about, which is how does my theory relate not just to relationships, but to why you should respect the rights of others. And it's directly related also to something that just came up in a question about free will, about what's special about human beings, about why what it is to survive as a human being is not what it is to survive as a worm or as a dog. That we are beings of integrated mind and body, and our survival involves the achievement of values, not just values that are material, but values that are psychological as well. It should be obvious to anyone who has friends how much value friends bring into your life, how much value loved ones bring into your life, how happy they make you because you see your values embodied in the person of another. Other people are of enormous value to us, which is another way of saying other people serve directly to promote our own self-interest. Some people more than others. That's why we choose friends. That's why we choose loved ones. And that's the basic answer to the question of what reason does someone concerned with living a happy, flourishing life, pursuing their own self-interest, have to respect the rights of others. Other people are of an enormous value to us, even people who are not our friends and who are not our loved ones. Everyone is a potential value to us. If we want to live in a world filled with amazing innovations and technology, we need to leave other people free to produce those things. We don't live like animals by looting and expropriating. We live as producers by producing our own values and trading them with others, and we have to leave them free to do that. There's every reason in the world for someone who's concerned with their own self-interest, rationally speaking, to want to respect the rights of others.
The next question.
I think that was also for him.
Sorry.
Yeah, that troubles me a bit. This idea that somebody is only valuable if they can provide something for you. I would say that people have more of an intrinsic worth for what they are and who they are. So in the Christian, let's say, description of what love is, there's certainly an element of when we love something, certainly we love the benefits that that thing or that person provides us, right? Or whether it's God or a spouse, we love the things that they do for us or provide for us, give us feelings, whatever. But there's also, in the Christian understanding, Christian description of love, this idea that we love the thing intrinsically for itself, or it's my wife, let's say. There are things about her as a being beyond what she gives or provides to me that I love her for intrinsically, for who she is. And then there's also a third aspect of love, as Christians understand it, that there's a desire for union with the beloved. So when you love something, you desire to be united with it, whether that's a spouse or ultimately in our loving relationship with God. Of course, we love the things that God provides, right? Life and breath, so on. We love him for who he is intrinsically, but then we also want a union. And again, I think that's because of how he created us to be part of his communion, part of the Trinity, to extend the fellowship of the Trinity, to be in loving relationship with him and other humans.
Okay, the next question is also for Dr. Bayer. The philosopher Nietzsche believed life was meaningless, simply suffering until death, and even praised suicide in some circumstances. What do you think is missing in his philosophy?
I'm not sure that's entirely correct assessment of what Nietzsche thought. Nietzsche thought that when everybody knows the God is dead idea, he obviously thinks that the absence of theistic belief in Western culture brings the possibility of nihilism into the world, but that's only if you don't fill that vacuum with an alternative. He offered alternatives. Now, I don't necessarily endorse them, but he thought you could have meaning in life through the pursuit of will to power. Now, that's the part that I don't endorse. The major difference between Nietzsche's view and mine is that Nietzsche is basically, at the end of the day, a determinist irrationalist. This will to power notion is the idea that we are all striving for dominance over others in the same way as animals do. And human ways of doing this are just more sophisticated than the animal's way. I mean, my view is that we're not pushed around by a deterministic will to power like Nietzsche thought. I already said something about why I think human beings have free will that makes them unique with respect to other animals, that we survive by reason. Nietzsche didn't think much of reason. He thought reason was just a rationalization invented by philosophers to fill the gap left by God. But it's not. It's a real fact about us. It's a real fact about what makes our biology unique. It's how we survive. It's how we create values. It's how we thrive. It's how we benefit through trade from others, which gives us reason, for reasons mentioned earlier, not to sacrifice them. So there's lots of big differences between my view and Nietzsche's view.
I think we can go on to the next question.
Mr. Johnson, what do you say of Bayer's Abraham example? Is he a moral figure? Was being willing to kill his son moral?
You know, I've given two possible explanations or possible interpretations for what's going on in that story. But let's say it is, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive either, right? There could be multiple things that we should be learning from this story. And one of them might, in fact, be trusting God even when we don't understand things. So, for example, I could envision a scenario where a general or a leader in a military would want to instill trust in his troops, that they should trust him out on the battlefield even if they don't understand his commands. And so, for example, he might have some sort of practices or do some things in their training that might cause them a lot of confusion and not understand why he's commanding such things. He might even command something silly or outrageous to instill them and to teach them that they should trust even when they get confused or when they don't understand, so that when they are on the battlefield, then they will trust him. So even in this case, if part of the story or part of the intent of the story is to encourage us to trust God even when we don't understand, I still think it would be appropriate. Keeping in mind those other two lessons that I think are being taught through the story, that child sacrifice is evil and that he shouldn't do that. Animal sacrifice was instead what God was pointing him to, and the fact that God loves us and is willing to sacrifice his own son to do something that he wouldn't never ask us to actually carry out.
Trusting something even when we don't understand it is exactly the kind of blind faith that I'm talking about and warning against. And there's a big difference between the kind of trust that Abraham is supposed to have in God and the kind that some soldier has if he's listening to a general he's had a lot of experience with. He's seen him in action before. He knows the way he works. He understands how he wins victories. There's things that my boss tells me to do frequently which I don't fully understand, but I know that he's been very successful at the decisions that he's made. That is rational trust. But when a voice appears out of the desert, out of nowhere, telling you kill your son, you have no basis, no track record on which to trust this, especially when it so directly violates and contradicts everything you know. And just to use this as an opportunity to answer something given before, so Mr. Johnson said that he couldn't be convinced that God was really commanding him to do something as evil as to kill his own son. But then it's worth thinking about, well, on what basis could you know that it was evil? Is there something you can observe about life, independent of what God tells you, that tells you what's good and evil? If so, there are ways to know about what's good and evil that have no dependence on God whatsoever, and that's part of the reason why people who believe in Christianity bristle at the idea that it could be good to kill their own child, because they know they have other good reasons that have nothing to do with religion for why it would be bad.
That actually closes the questions, although there's a lot more good ones here. Should we just go to the results?
I feel like my voice is running out.
Poll? Here's an easy one for Dr. Johnson. Why is a loving God a useful purpose? Is it for God or for me? This seems like a meaningless purpose.
Can you read the question again? I'm not quite sure.
Why is loving God a useful purpose? Is it useful for God or for me? This seems like a meaningless purpose.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the assumption behind the question is, one of the basis of Dr. Bayer's theory is that something is only good if it's good for something. And so with that assumption, asking why is God's love good for him? Is it good for us? I would say yes to both, but irregardless, I think that there is intrinsic goodness there. So I don't have this assumption in my theory that there has to be a use for something in order for it to be good. I don't have that sort of functionality, or maybe not functionality, the pragmatism that something has to be good for something in order for it to be good. I think God, by definition, as we understand him, is goodness itself. The measuring stick, if you will, of moral goodness, the love there, and justice. And so when we do things that reflect that, I think that's why it's considered morally good, because it reflects ultimate moral goodness.
This is a nice question to wrap things up with. There's been a lot of discussion about what is the experience of thinking about morality. Now, that idea of experience means a lot of things. It's been a kind of combination of what are our feelings, what are our thoughts. But the primary sense of experience is perceptual experience of the world, of the facts that you see with your own eyes. And I would ask people in our audience to think about, when did you first learn the term good and bad? I suspect it was when you were very young, when you were told that there were, when you learned that there were good things to eat, bad things to keep away from, dangerous people who were out to hurt you. As you advanced, you formed a more abstract version of that concept where you thought there's a good way to live, there are good things to do for you and for others. All of the examples from your experience at an early age that had to do with good and bad, all had to do with what's good for something, for someone. That's a fundamental part of your experience. So when someone comes along and says, well, there's also this kind of goodness that's not good for anything and doesn't really connect to that basic experience you had of learning that concept in the first place, but you should believe in it anyway. That right there, that is an excellent example of someone asking you to believe something on faith that has no basis in experience. Thank you.
Yeah, those are the results for opinion poll. On the left, you have the side of Ayn Rand Johnson. On the right, you have the side of Ben Bayer, and you can see how it has changed over the course of this event. Thank you.
Anything else to say? Maybe you should say thank you.
I want to thank the speakers and the Ayn Rand Institute and the Ratio Christi group, and also the audience. I think the questions you asked were excellent.